Hi, everyone. I'm going to be talking about the social limits of scientific certainty, teams, networks, other ways in which connections end up shaping the way in which we think collectively. And it's the end of the day, and I really respect that. There's not a huge hole in the middle of the audience. There's a small hole, and I'll try to keep the energy high. So I run a little center called Knowledge Lab, where we're focused on trying to take large-scale data, machine learning, and intelligent crowdsourcing to on the one hand, represent knowledge in new and deeper and various ways. Two, to kind of understand the scientific and scholarly process. And when I say understand, I really mean kind of a big data science studies. How can we understand how it is that the system as a whole engages in heuristics and through various processes to kind of come up with the outputs it does? And then finally, and I'm going to spend less time talking about this last part today, transforming the scientific and scholarly process in part by basically using those heuristics and biases, statistical and machine learning instruments to generate hypotheses, which may not be relevant for a science focused on elections every 4 years, but is relevant for basically a large-scale genomics lab that's generating 10,000 hypotheses or 10,000 experiments a week. So we need to be able to think about how to scale up these scientific logic so that we can address the moment that we're in. And so we spend a lot of time kind of thinking about measuring knowledge, representations, descriptions, explanations, predictions, etc. I'm delighted to be invited to this event, and I'm excited that conversations about meta-knowledge and the science of science and Metascience are kind of going on. I really believe that these can help tune the way in which we think about the scientific and scholarly process and improve our return on investment. I also confess that I'm an academic advisor to Meta, and I realized about halfway through the summer when I was working on a 3D printer with my 11-year-old to digitally print 3D printers, that maybe Meta is also a kind of a personality type. And I think I've seen some others in the poster session that this is, this is a deep trait. So how does science as a system think? And I don't just mean a human, brain here, but cephalopod brain. I mean, how is it that this whole collective system thinks as an entity? And I'm going to talk specifically about if science is a complex system with multiple parts that interact and kind of yield emergent solutions, how dense social connections can and typically do distort collective certainty in various ways. One way to think about this is thinking about the social structure of disagreement. So a research project that I worked on with a couple of folks in the audience here, Misha Tuplitsky and Daniel Acuna. We looked at PLOS One. So PLOS One, arguably the editorial and review threshold is just that the science is accurate. Not that the science is interesting, not that the science is compelling or innovative. The science is accurate. And when we looked at the reviews in a large sample of neuroscience works, we found that there's really about the same agreement, which is a correlation of 0.19, which is the same as the ink blot test, at least in the US, as there was when you were taking into account significance and large-scale alternatives. Also, there is a linear or superlinear distance between co-authorship distance and the likelihood of rejection, a first rejection in the context of these reviews, which is to say that these things that we think about as tastes, maybe cluster tastes, are in fact clustered epistemologies. The people who are working together in groups actually think that their work is correct and that other work is incorrect. So how does this end up shaping the broader community in terms of results? Now, I'm going to argue that centralized communities, at least in the cases that we've studied, and we've studied several, generate typically less replicable results. Now, I was going to call this maybe in the context of a replication crisis. Now I'll call it a replication renaissance. I've been told that that's what it's called today. But things are being retracted. People are talking about those retractions. I'm going to argue that there's actually some forces that are accelerating with respect to the weakness of the science underlying some of those retractions. And we're going to try to pilot this high-throughput strategy for conceptual replication and reproducibility. So we're going to look at it first in the context of drug-gene interactions across about 70,000 research papers, empirical research projects. And we're going to ask the question, what collaboration structure, what community structure would bolster results, robustness, and replicability? Would it be a sparse structure? Would it be a centralized structure, right, with a center director at the center who's kind of like, co-funding a bunch of smaller projects? Would it be a completely connected network? And I would say there's a lot at stake here. Why is it that these more dense networks might have an impact? Well, they're communication-induced dependencies. People share protocols, they share expectations, they share ways of interpreting their results and findings. It's Jean Perrin who established Avogadro's number with many different independent methodological approaches. Those may be seen as more robust. And the sharing of things like media. These are helicells. Even though science can increase in replicability, right, across these communicating labs, it may decrease in the likelihood of being generalizable outside those labs, for example, to the clinic. So our strategy here was to take these 70,000 claims from the literature and then align them with a high-throughput published experiment, in this case, the Lynx L1000 study. Now, the idea is not that the high-throughput experiment, which kind of evaluated each of these claims experimentally about 120 times under different experimental conditions, different cell conditions, different times, for example, in the drug dosage that was provided. But that basically the high-throughput experiment isn't suffering basically from the same social dependency issues and incentives that scientists do in the scientific space. And so if we take the probability of the support in the literature by the independence of the researchers, which is to say they're not using the same methods, they're not talking with each other, or they haven't collaborated in the past, they haven't cited the same work, and we build with kind of a naive, kind of uniform probability, some relative probability estimate, which is the product of these two things, we get claims which are highly credible from the perspective of the literature, which are incredible or disputed, and the vast majority which are, I'll call exploratory, which means they show up once in the literature. And it turns out that science is not totally broken, thank goodness, where we have very high replicability, or when we have very high credibility from the literature, that's associated with a much stronger likelihood that the findings will replicate across these 130 some odd replications. If it's contradictory, it's much less likely than random that they replicate. Other things kind of check out as well, interestingly. So when there's variability in the Lynx L1000 results, that's more likely to be associated with contradiction in the literature. So people in the literature think they're talking about the same thing, but oh, no, they used a different cell line, they dosed it for a longer period of time, et cetera. But now we look at the structure of the scientific community. So we looked at the centralization of the scientific communities that produce these findings. In this case, there's one author that's on virtually all the papers in this one particular claim area, right? This particular drug that decreases human gene F3 versus a much more democratic rendering here. We also looked at the social, methodological, and prior knowledge. When I say prior knowledge, I mean the citations, the things that you read, the expectations that you come in with. Across each of these, each community in these contexts. We just looked at the Chicard Index, which assessed the relative average intersection over the union, basically, of authors, of methods that they used, and of the prior knowledge that they cited. Now, just so you kind of have a sense, in the broader field as a whole, if you look at fields growing over time, growth in a field, for example, biochemistry, material science, et cetera, as those fields grow, there's what I'll call a canonical crystallization. So with growth, there's an exponential decline in the likelihood that any new paper is going to be able to enter the canon that almost everybody cites in these contexts. So this increasing prior knowledge dependence, essentially, is a function, basically, of the success of fields. And it turns out that it's even overstated. I mean, it's understated by citations. It becomes more realistically estimated if you actually look at the words that get siphoned essentially through these fields. They become much more hardened. So we looked at each of these papers in terms of their agreement, their overlap in methods, authors, and references. Sometimes there were many articles, 11 articles, for example, but everybody was collaborating with one another. They were basically the same scientists across these contexts, and they all agreed, or at least all the ones that were working together agreed, and the ones that weren't didn't agree. So the idea here is that densely connected communities involving repeat collaborations are exposed to similar methods, similar prior knowledge, and they may be reliable but invalid. And social dependencies, we find, we actually evaluate this induce massive agreement in this context. So it's much more likely. So there's like a 93% likelihood that once somebody makes a claim in one direction, that it will be repeated over and over within the same direction, and that's augmented as a function of the likelihood that you're on the same team, that you're an author from one of those prior papers, protecting your brand, or again, communicating, performing precisely the same experiment. There's also this kind of connectivity versus generalizability trade-off in these contexts, where you may have 10 supporting studies, but only 4 independent groups that are producing this evidence. In this case, there's 10 supporting studies, but only 2 independent approaches which are applied to these data. Now, the same week that our paper was published in eLife, there was another paper published, presumably funded off of the same actually large-scale DARPA project on big mechanism at about the same time. This is Peter Sorker and colleagues at Harvard and affiliated universities, in which they show how to basically maximize replication as a function of this design, where they take one center and that center communicates information, but also materials to other centers, and then they look at the limits, basically, of replicability or replication. Again, a useful exercise, but I would call it an academic exercise in the sense that this decreases the likelihood that if we perturb those effects, we'll find robust results. So imagine that we have kind of across a range of experimental conditions, some effect strength that's kind of like conditional on one particular context, versus no matter how we perturb those experimental conditions, we find the same finding. Both of these are reproducible. I would call this more likely, in some sense, technology, and the second, science, which is to say that it's transferable as a claim to other contexts. So when we actually look at these, we find that they're enormously correlated. Social dependencies are correlated with limited methodological variation. So the 0.74 correlation between social independence and methodological independence, 0.79 between methodological independence and the likelihood that you're citing the same prior work. But findings from decentralized communities are much more likely to replicate when we assemble them all into a model, which is to say the support from the literature improves the likelihood that they're going to replicate, but centralization within those communities strongly decreases the likelihood that they'll replicate. And in fact, all of the benefit that you get from improvement gets rolled back as a function of these communication-induced dependencies, which is to say 15 studies by one network connection of labs looks the same in its replication likelihood as a single lab, right? It's been performed a single experiment in a single context. So we find, again, much more decentralized communities are much more likely to replicate. Socially independent actors are much more likely to replicate. We've looked at this finding in other contexts. So we do the same thing basically in gene-gene interactions, for example. And here, we actually try to turn it around as an instrument to say, how much can we predict? If we want to extract claims from the literature to do high-throughput prediction and testing, can we basically assess the probability of the correctness of a claim as a function of the features of the articles and the teams that produced it? And it turns out we can predict about 77% of that likelihood, largely as a function of kind of triangulation. So the larger network of claims that are related to other things that surround that claim end up triangulating and also providing a kind of a surveillance against that claim that's correct or incorrect. When we turn that around through Bayes' theorem to assess the likelihood of any particular interaction given the claim that's made, whether it's positive or negative, and the features associated with those papers, we're able to predict about, we have an AUC of about 0.65. So we're able to do less well, partly because the concentration of researchers on just a few findings, right? It's not just that people are all collaborating around the same experiment. As a result of collaborating around the same experiment, it also decreases our kind of total ability to recover replication rates from the field as a whole. And in fact, if we look and perform a simulation that says, if rather than focusing everybody on the same replications, if we distributed them across the range of possible effects that they could explore, so if we just look at the actual history of findings that are replicated over time, we end up having a much, much higher AUC rate. So our return on investment in terms of replicable science goes dramatically up because we're not focusing all of our attention effectively on the same claims. All this to say that there's necessarily a trade-off here. I mean, these are, basically independent replications are, they work to increase the focus of and replicability of science, but it's expensive. And if we could basically spread that expense across claims, then we would know more. Finally, we've been looking at this in the context of Cochrane library clinical trials. So in the Cochrane approach, they basically already cluster papers into kind of research areas. And so we basically take those research areas and we just say, what's the likelihood that across the research areas, right, that are basically evaluated, if this dependency does that basically increase under dispersion? And one of the concerns that we've had is that almost all the approaches for correcting for errors in these meta-analyses are corrections for over-dispersion, which are predicted basically by coalitions of researchers, right? So where everybody agrees, everybody's connected to one another, it leads to strong under-dispersion in the data, which looks, from the perspective of these meta-analyses, like more replicability. We argue that's much less replicability. And so we're working to kind of improve measures in that context. So connected communities end up being potentially associated with these recon results, but there are costs, right? So independent, decentralized research communities promote robust findings, but they face coordination problems, and we need to become much more comfortable with failure, basically, if we're going to invest in this distributed approach to replication, conceptual replication in this case. Now, I didn't perform each of these research studies as part of a collected whole. I'm telling a story here, but it seems that there are other consequences to basically clustering, collaboration, and communication-induced dependency. So, for example, in a study that Jacob Foster talked a little bit about yesterday, flocking. So people aren't just connected because they share the same authors, they share the same materials, but they basically cluster around the same claims to investigate over time. And this dramatically slows basically our ability to achieve insight about all the things about which we study, even just the things which are in the literature. And so basically we kind of look at this through simulation and estimation from the literature, and we find that, again, this kind of increased collaboration, because individual researchers are clustered around these same claims, right, that everybody else is clustered around, because if they go out further, it would be useful for science, but it wouldn't be useful for them, right? It basically puts too much risk on the researcher. And so there's this deviance or deviation between the incentives of the individual and our incentives for kind of a global and useful science. Another kind of impact of cross collaboration and networking is the impact of big overlapping teams, not on just the replicability of finding or the speed with which things are found, but the disruption, the degree to which basically findings disrupt the current frontier of science. So there's big teams everywhere. This was talked about yesterday. In fact, I think this figure, Marta had this figure, I think, on her slide. Scientific teams increasingly look like American football teams. There's different roles that are played by each individual in these projects. And I would say this is kind of a critical assessment of the literature. Bigger is better, that if we have large teams, we must need large teams. Our problems in the current world must demand them. And just in kind of looking at certain kinds of large-scale team projects, like the 2017 Nobel Prize project associated with these two massive interferometers which detected gravitational waves for the first time, this was a massive feat of 21st century science and engineering. It took 30-plus years to calibrate the instrument. But it contrasts dramatically with, the 100-year-old hypothesis, the single-author team, Albert Einstein, who came up with the theory, and other investigators like Louis Weber, who basically identified experimental findings which deviated. We don't believe those findings now, but that deviated from the general relativity estimate. This experiment was a wonderful experiment. It was perhaps one of the most conservative experiments in history, in the sense that the assumption of any finding from the experiment which deviated from the theoretical estimate was that it was a problem with the apparatus, right? So there's no way that the experiment itself could generate surprise by definition. So we just wanted to look at the degree to which teams, as they changed in size, ended up loading on the degree to which those teams kind of created, explored, subverted versus exploited in succession, found and developed things that were relevant, et cetera. So we looked at science, we looked at technology, we looked at software development in GitHub, about 65 million teams, and we used this measure which basically assesses the likelihood that a new finding, a new paper, a new piece of software eclipses the work on which it builds, which is to say that everybody subsequent tells a story either that this thing was the first thing, right, in that story, there's nothing before it, or it's an incremental addition to a story of prior developments. And it turns out that this ends up differentiating between all kinds of different, review articles versus original articles. If you kind of distinguish the words that come out as a function of being loaded heavily on disruption versus development, you see kind of like endorse, confirm, demonstrate versus change, introduce, and advance. I mean, these just come out for free basically as a result of the structural measure. And we used it because it was so simple that one could evaluate it across all of these contexts. So we basically took every paper, every patent, every piece of software, and we assessed the relative likelihood that future things, so these are kind of, these leaves that are pointing up, ignore the past. The brown leaves that are pointing down recognize the past. We do this for all 65 million of these products, and what we find is that with additional team size, there's this almost exponential decline in the likelihood that each work that's produced by these team members ends up disrupting the future. In software and patents, we find it at every slice of the distribution that we can slice through. What's a small team? Is it 1, 2, 3? It doesn't matter what a small team is. You can cut it at any point in the distribution, and you'll find the same effect. What times and places? We found it in every time and place that we looked at. In fact, we found when we controlled for topics, through some massive kind of embedding the entire scientific space, controlling for authors and topics, that within authors, 66% of this effect held, which is to say the same author working on the same class of project, adding one co-author to the paper, manifested 66% of this decline, basically, in the likelihood that that finding would disrupt the frontier. It turns out that the optics of where it is that science is looking is also quite different. So large-scale teams are much more likely to focus on yesterday's hits. Basically, it reduces their risk and provides momentum to the eyeballs that are focused on yesterday's successes and are basically attracted and captured by them today, which is why it is that if we were thinking about a production studio, are they more likely to invest in Slumdog Millionaire or in Transformers 9 or 10, or 11, And because whatever those, they're going to invest in Transformers because they're going to receive Transformers 8 receipts minus epsilon, right? So they're assured to have those customers, and as a result of this, disruption delays impact, which is to say, if you look at the Sleeping Beauty Index, which is basically a measure of the concavity or convexity of the citation distribution with time, then what you see is that small team papers are much, much more likely to become successful much further into the future. The large-scale papers, especially those that tune themselves to the present, are likely to receive all of their impact immediately and then have that tail off. So I'm going to kind of argue more broadly that social connection ends up conditioning and being associated with cultural collapse in a whole bunch of cases, which is to say, cultural objects on the interwebs, language extinction with social contact, biological extinction with ecological contact. We can talk about trade, my economics friends, but with basically the mutual information between any two variables, right, as it rises, the joint entropy, which is to say the joint information that they're involved in producing, ends up going down necessarily. And we actually see this when we embed basically 21st century physics to a Poincare disk. There's a hyperbolic space that captures the centralization of research, that as we have more collaboration between departments and between researchers, that's associated with a similar and proportionate collapse in the likely topics that those individuals focus on. So the underlying kind of haunting question for me is, to what degree is science and technology that we're interested in exploring a smooth fitness surface, or is it a rugged, unexpected fitness surface? If it's a smooth surface, then network teams and network communities and large teams what they do is they hill climb, and that's the most efficient way in which to solve that problem and scale that surface. If it's a rugged landscape, then we want individuals and small teams to scatter, right? We want to invest in failure in the context for a collective success. And I'm just going to throw up a couple of findings which suggest that this is a complex landscape. So for example, it's seemingly smooth. This is a project in which we tried to predict all of next year's papers and all of next year's patents. Now, we have an impoverished representation of next year's papers and patents. It's just a typed set of keywords. So, there will be 17 papers next year which study these 2 diseases with these 4 methods and these 2 chemical traces. There will be 12 papers that study this overlapping disease and method, et cetera, et cetera. But as a result of a relatively simple embedding model, we're able to predict 97% of next year's papers and patents. Unsurprising because there's enormous inertia. We stick around as researchers, we impose our questions on future. But the best predictor of outsized success, right? So we can predict basically 50% of the likelihood of being in the top 10% of citations, ex ante, right? Just as a result of unpredictability under that most predictive model, right? Which is far more than any other. So basically, this is the momentum model, right? This model suggests that scientists are like walking as a random walk over this hypergraph space. And if we just take that momentum model, the best predictor, basically, of outsized success is things that violate, basically, that model, right? That are the most unpredictable under that model. And in fact, if we dive into the teams, 70% of that 50% of predictability comes as a result not of collaborations or an unusual history, but of people from one area, aliens, like who have a background of patterns which are completely unfamiliar to the area in which they trudge over and publish their findings in, right? So that unpredictability that comes as a result of combination is a result of combining basically a set of experiences which are unfamiliar and unique to the area in which they're applying those findings. Now, this is work that I won't have time to talk much about. This is with Daxun Wang, forthcoming in Nature, in which we look at the success of people who are applying for grants, people who are doing startups, terrorists that are trying to kill people. And what we find is there's a partition in this space between those who end up persisting, right? They shoot with a particular set of components, for example, in their grant application, and they don't overlearn from failure. They actually learn less from failure, and they accelerate with every additional application. They change less, they spend less time applying. They're the ones who are the most likely actually to succeed eventually. So there's hope for the system. Fields are also separated by jargon. So another kind of demonstration, I think, of the complexity of this space. This is work with Carl Bergstrom and others in the audience. So fields end up being separated by jargon that basically is efficient to communicate between people of same interests. And we have a simple information theoretic model that characterizes the amount of learning, right, or code lookup you'd have to do to move from field to field. So this is a process which kind of facilitates, again, smooth, moving up this surface of science. But it turns out that when you measure ambiguity, right, not jargon, right, words that are fundamentally polysemous, even polysemous within context we did this across about 30 million scientific papers, we found that more ambiguous works were much more likely to result in kind of fields that as they cited that original work, they cited each other, right? The social learning that takes place, and you basically got the generation of new fields that came as a result of people violating essentially the singular theories that took place in their fields. Finally, we have work that suggests that even political polarization in this era where people's information consumption ends up being correlated with political attitudes and beliefs, when we calculate the likelihood that kind of people on Wikipedia produce information in kind of left or right political campaigns, which correlates with about a third of their likelihood to express an ideological preference one way or the other, that more polarized teams are systematically associated not only in political pages, but also in social issues pages and in science pages of producing pages which are seen universally to be of higher quality. And these are people who are evaluating them independent of any underlying process. When we evaluate the process, it's because they're talking about fewer things in more ways. And they're exploiting the institutions of Wikipedia. All this to say, however, the clustered, single ideologies do worse than multiple ideologies. That singular kind of field vocabularies end up generating more sparks in the context of new fields than multiple vocabularies. That basically people who are violating the expectations of fields are much more likely to generate outsized success and attention. So the problem is everything, right? The internet, email, communication, information and communication technologies, et cetera. The problem is that this is accelerating. These meetings are accelerating. Listservs are accelerating. Like people are kind of collapsing to opportunities to engage with one another that drives out diversity from these approaches. And if we believe that this diversity is associated with sustainable growth and sustainable innovation, then we'll have to think carefully about the degree to which we're willing to fuel or starve that. There are socio-technical solutions. I'm not going to talk much about them, but we could have a competition policy. We just break up the trusts, as it were, the large centers, the correlated institutes, et cetera. We can have an explicit pluralism policy. If we have a field that can gather together and make decisions collectively, we could actually shift our thresholds. There's a 1968 meson spectroscopy meeting in the University of Pennsylvania, in which it's described in the meeting notes that people, as there was an increase in simulations relative to the number of physical experiments that were being performed in particle physics, they just sat down and decided to raise the sigma. They were just going to raise it. I mean, I'm just imagining like a bunch of sociologists like getting together and deciding to kind of like raise the threshold systematically and in proportion to the relative hypotheses that are being asked relative to experiments performed. I would also argue that we should think about generating hypotheses with bots that aren't subject to the same demands for security, the demands for promotion, the demands to be close to others in the scientific field. That for fields in which experiments are increasingly cheap and data is increasingly large, that we need to do this to basically begin to explore the vast nether regions of scientific and technical possibility. So the final point is just that often we talk about sustainable innovation. Promoting bridging is an important strategy, but that's only meaningful insofar as we protect independence. And so I want to talk about the importance, or have us think about the importance of that protection, that ubiquitous connection crystallizes and potentially kills insight, certainty, understanding, that multiple robust models increase both individual and collective understanding. Disconnection between fields, right, between ideologies, between approaches, and then recombination adaptively evolves that understanding. And the hope is that this can kind of allow us to think about a long-term and better science. Now, obviously, this work was not performed alone, but with lots of friends and collaborators, many of them here in the audience. Thank you.
We have less time for questions, so please keep them to questions.
But you can come and give me your comments later. I welcome them.
So I'm asking a question. Well, I'm handing the microphone to my colleague here.
Oh.
Thank you very much. I'm Boris Weitzman. I'm from Chen Zuckerberg Meta, and thank you very much for great talk, and thank you for mentioning us. We are very honored. I have a question. You have some inferences, and I wonder, for example, you say that if you have a higher network connection, you have less variability. An alternative explanation would be that if you have a problem which requires a lot of complex expertise, you don't have many people who have it, and they tend to corroborate. For example, if I have very unique experiment, I need to write a paper with people who know how to do this experiment. And so basically what I'm saying that it might be, the alternative explanation might be that the problems that require large teams or problems that require higher network connection they actually lead to some things like lower variability and problems with reproducibility.
Yeah, I would agree at the extremes. The fact that we can find almost all the effect within person and within topic, and even within type. So we look at review papers, right? Same person, same topic. Add one person, if that one person is like going from 1 to 2, again, this is like an exponential decline, so that's the biggest difference. We see that difference. So I think there's no question, there's some experiments that are so valuable, but they're so large that we can only do one. I think all I'd like to suggest, and so I talk with the NIH frequently where they are like, well, what about, we've got, we want one standard, like one standard for annotation, like, or one, like all we can afford is, and I think this just suggests the importance of 2, competition in the space, right? That just, expanding the number of kind of diverse representations, diverse models, diverse approaches ends up, yes, it's more expensive. There's no cheap answer to any of the solutions that I'm talking about, right? When a research lab is like, we've got everything set up, we can rerun these experiments, extremely cheap. The problem is the result is cheap. The result is cheap. And so I absolutely agree. I'm not saying there aren't sciences that like require enormous teams, maybe singular teams. It's just there are many things for which they don't require singular teams, and we should consider whether or not we want to invest in like 2 or N approaches rather than 1. But I mean, fine, fair question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
My question is about slide 127.
I think that's this one here.
It's another on how far do you want to push on the extreme here. And one way that I was thinking that your argument might push is counter to what a lot of the arguments of the prior talks we've had at the meeting, which is sharing code, documenting your process, making your methods more accessible might actually reduce the speed with which we get to robustness.
Thanks for nailing that and turning the screw. So I would absolutely agree. I mean, on the one hand, sharing, lifts up, all boats. The problem is it brings them all into the same boathouse, right? So it really does decrease the likelihood that, somebody else, when they're approaching the problem, they approach it with a different operationalization, which leads to this possibility of fragile findings. Right, and I know Misha. Is Misha still here? You here? Oh, there we go. So we had a finding in a paper that I didn't present here, where we were looking at replicability in social science, and we had this kind of effect where we kind of like we created models which kind of corresponded to like all the models that are published ever on the GSS, and we basically ran all the alternative models, and we found that, if you like perturb the models a little bit, it was much less likely that they'll replicate in the future. And we thought this was all well and good. And then like Misha started to, try to reproduce it on different software and a different machine using a different library. And we could not, that was the most delicious effect of that paper. The reason we haven't, it's still a great paper, but it was like, if we hadn't been forced to kind of go back and change the platform as a result just of time, that effect would be out there, published and doing its work. So I think it's really critical to think about disconnection and evaluating disconnection and conceptual replication. I love the exercises of constrained, precise replication, but they are only basically a ceiling limit. When they come to like represent standard practice, like, oh my gosh, let's just all start doing this in the context of science, I think we're totally screwed. I think science will become much less replicable in a conceptual sense. Like it would be much less likely for people to take findings from one paper, take them to another area or another context and use them. So thanks for turning that screw for me.
So the question, first of all, I should say that I'm under the influences of two training kind of things on me. One is that in biology, it's very often said that the statement that nothing in biology makes sense unless in the light of evolution by Dobzhansky. And also was told that you always want to take a complex system and reduce to some few fundamental principles. So when I'm sitting at the meeting, and my feeling is that like science never existed in a state that was productive, successful, the state to me epitomized with Bell Labs. So the question is, the first one, what is, if you look back at places like Bell Labs, Laboratory of Molecular Biology, or like early ages of Cold Spring Harbor, what were the fundamental principles, if there were any, that would determine the success, which is amazing? And second, if you can reconstruct the success without having these principles in mind.
So, I mean, I don't know. I wasn't at Bell Labs.
Well, there's a good
but,
book
No,
about
no.
it,
But but one of the things I would say, for example, that was really kind of, one of the things that we found when people, if you just look at, for example, the small teams that receive funding versus those that get awards, we find that the small teams that are intensively funded look in terms of their likelihood of disruption just like the large teams. So it's not about small teams, it's about risk-taking. And I would say one of the things that characterizes at least the golden age of Bell Labs is that they basically had group level of evaluation rather than individual level evaluation. So basically, those individual groups could push out that tail of risk. It's harder if every single grant that you put in is evaluated on its own merits. Then there's no portfolio. You can't you can't balance less risky and more risky science. So I would say one of the things that characterizes systematically some of these most successful engines of innovation are that they took huge risks. They were allowed to balance those risks as a function of different evaluation mechanisms than some of the granting agencies that we have today. So I guess with that, I'll close down, but come chat with me later, please.